I could absolutely see Russia and China and North Korea executing weapons sales, executing trade where they send weapons in exchange for oil or in exchange for other natural resources. I could see them arming and equipping and sharing intelligence, of course, also with Iran. I could see them facilitating Iranian movements that are illegal, right? Facilitating an IRGC movement from Iran into Israel or from Iran into Lebanon by way of some sort of Chinese transport or Russian transport, obfuscating the movement altogether. These are all realistic possibilities and ways that those countries would gain favor and continue to show support for Iran. The I think strategic benefit of Russia and China and North Korea showing support to Iran is that Iran is well positioned in the Middle East. Iran is already a rogue nation in the eyes of the world. It's already a world that doesn't want to be part of a larger world order. So they have access to oil, they have access to natural resources, they have access to personnel and people and a theocracy that's been largely shaped by an ideology that isn't accurate, which is exactly the kind of ideology that thrives in those Eastern countries, right? Russia shapes its ideology, China shapes its ideology, North Korea shapes its ideology. So they don't want to just cut Iran off, but they also don't necessarily want to get pulled into a larger conflict that drains their resources because of Iran's choices. So it's going to be an interesting few months to see how it all plays out.
I asked a question to the Israeli ambassador to the US yesterday about the risk of Russia using the peace negotiations as a way to pressure the US to end the war against Iran, and China leveraging the tariff negotiations with Trump to try to end the war in Iran. Do you think that's a possibility as well?
That's the most realistic possibility, to be honest. I think that what we're seeing here is that Israel gets to attack Iran, which is something it wants to do. And that's also something that the West wants somebody to do. So they might as well support Israel in doing that. And of course, the weapons that Israel's using to launch that attack are Western-made weapons. So the U.S. economy is benefiting from the conflict that Israel launches, not only against Hezbollah and Hamas, but also against Israel. So there's lots of secondary benefits that are happening to the United States. The idea is, how do you make those benefits less beneficial? And that's going to be what you see with Russia and China. Are they going to use those negotiations for Ukraine and those negotiations for tariffs as a counterpoint to protect Iran? Like I was saying, the conversation here, to me, the relevant conversation is less about Iran and more about Israel. Because there's an important thing that's also happening here, Mario. Every time Israel launches a new attack, every time they expand their territory, every time they initiate a new conflict, like they initiated the conflict in Gaza, and they initiated the conflict in Syria, and they initiated the conflict in Iran. Every time Israel initiates a new conflict, they're creating a new foundation of future radicals that will hate Israel. So the Iranian theocracy is not going to look weak coming out of this. If anything, there's going to be a whole fresh foundation of people who now believe what the theocracy has to say and all agree that Israel needs to be destroyed. And the same thing is happening in Gaza, and the same thing's happening in Lebanon, and the same thing's happening in Yemen. There's radicals are always being born because they're feeling the devastation of a superior military force from Israel. The United States learned this the hard way on 9/11, and it took us 20 years to figure this out before we decided that fighting against ideological radicals is a very difficult game, because the harder you fight, the more radicals you create.
Yeah, and there's 90 million people in Iran. That goes to the next point, though, is there's reports that Israel is potentially looking at a regime change in Iran. That's an objective of theirs. We heard Netanyahu's speech a couple of days ago. How unlikely is it that this is not, just a potential bonus from the war, but that's not an objective or an actual objective that they're trying to reach? And number two, so first, is there an objective? And number two, if they do achieve that objective, what does that mean for Israel, Iran, and the rest of the Middle East?
So I would say that it's a very likely objective for Israel to pursue regime change, because it understands that unless they want to kill every Iranian citizen, what they need to do is change the government. And if they can change the government, then they would change the regime. The challenge, though, is that the current Iranian government is a mixed bag. Iran was already modernizing on its own. Its most recent president is less extremist, less radical, less theocratic than its previous president. So, in many ways, Israel's upsetting a society that was already transitioning in the right direction, and now they've assaulted and they're threatening the livelihood of an entire country because they disagreed with a handful of senior politicians that we now know they could have killed those politicians at any time, right? So if they are pursuing a regime change, it is not only likely, but when they pursue a regime change, the question becomes who will replace the current regime. Will they allow the Iranians to elect their own person? Will they try to appoint somebody themselves? Will they make Iran a shadow state, a puppet state of Israel? Will they try? And if they do, what comes next? Unfortunately, I think, Israel's actions are, they are tactically sound, but strategically flawed. They're doing an excellent job in choosing what tactics they use in order to execute operations that disrupt Iranian nuclear ambitions. But strategically, what are they trying to achieve? Are they trying to end Iran? Are they trying to end the theocracy? Are they trying to destroy radical anti-Israel sentiment? What are they trying to do? And how far are they willing to go? Because I don't think that they've thought it through. Netanyahu has a reputation now for starting conflict with no strategic end in sight, which is why he lost his war cabinet and why you see the conflict, even within Israel, opposing Netanyahu.
Yeah, and there's a discussion that Israel's goal of reaching a regime change in Iran could end up leading to a government change within Israel as people just get exhausted with all the wars. And I'm guessing you see that as would you say a high probability or just a possibility?
I think Netanyahu understands it as well. Like as soon as the Israeli people aren't thrown into a war, they're going to work on throwing out the people in their own political chain of command who have caused all this conflict. Israel is not, like the majority of Israelis aren't a huge fan of Netanyahu. They don't like his decisions. They don't like his policies. They don't like his authoritarian approach. They don't like his hawkish far-right government. So the only tool he has to prevent against an internal kind of overthrow is by keeping everybody's eyes focused external to Israel.
What worries me about a regime change, even if a regime is, if you compare the current regime to the pre-revolution Shah, Iran was, many people don't know, Iran was a very close ally. The closest ally within the Middle East to Israel. It was, I think, the first country or the second country to to recognize the existence of Israel. And a very liberal country. You'd see women walking around with bikinis to the Iran we see today. So I wouldn't be surprised if many people from the West, like me, like yourself, that would prefer a different government in Iran. But the risks of that, as we've seen in Syria, as we've seen in Libya, and the list goes on, is that could lead to just a complete destruction of a country. Like a country that is, has 80, 90% of the population in poverty, like we see in Yemen, that has no rule of law, like we see in Iraq, that is liberal, is not really better than a country. It's not too liberal, but at least it functions like some really wealthy countries that many of us visit. So do you worry that could be a case, that Israel's attempt for a regime change could be successful, but that could lead to more disastrous consequences for Iran and neighboring countries? And what would that mean for the region? We've got 90 people living in poverty, similar to what we have in Yemen, or a country is completely that has no rule of law and that has nuclear facilities as well.
So you're nailing all the right points there, Mario. I'm not sure that Israel or the United States cares whether or not Iran falls into political disarray, falls into some sort of internal civil war, similar to Libya and Syria and Yemen. I'm not sure that they're thinking about that in terms of an economic impact or a long-term military impact. I think their short-term idea is if it implodes and it falls apart, then we're all better for it. We're all a little bit safer. But the truth is that just because Iran isn't really inside Israel's sphere of influence and Iran isn't inside the United States' sphere of influence doesn't mean that Iran isn't inside the sphere of influence of close allies, right? We've got all of your Khaliji Arab states that have some sort of trade relationship with Iran, and then you have Iran's relationship with the developing world and the developing kind of
It's a BRICS member.
Right. So it's got economic ties, and it's got international geopolitical relevance beyond what I think the average American or the average Israeli understands. So if it falls into civil war, and if all of its military goods and its uranium and nuclear infrastructure is up for grabs, that doesn't put the world in a safer place. That puts the world in a more dangerous place.
Yeah, and it goes back to the point: will Russia and China allow Iran to go into a not a civil war, but it just would even allow for a regime change?
And if they do,
should not be ignored.
Would they force a Russian or Chinese motivated regime change instead of an Israeli regime change?
Exactly. And talking about Russia, how do you think that will impact Ukraine? Because Russia is obviously busy with Ukraine right now. They just lost one of their main suppliers. Could that weaken Russia much? How important was Iran for the Russian war against Ukraine?
I don't think anybody outside of intelligence circles really knows how important Iran was to Russia's continued conflict in Ukraine. Much of Russia's success is domestic. Much of their weapons making and weapons manufacturing capability really is within Russia itself. It benefited from partnerships early on, especially with Iran and North Korea. But as it continues to kind of project its war, it's learned the economic benefits of being a wartime country and a wartime economy. So I'm not sure that that damaging Iran is going to significantly hamper Russia's position in Ukraine, especially considering the fact that Ukraine is also struggling with maintaining support from the West.
In wars like this, how active would back-channel communications be? I remember, I'll give you an example. When I asked President Lukashenko that question, because obviously he was someone that mediated the, do you remember that, everyone forgets about it, the mutiny against Putin that happened 2 years ago. Everyone forgot what Wagner and Prigozhin did back then, and that Lukashenko got them to reach some sort of agreement. So I asked him about it, and he told me about all the communication that happened behind the scenes, and then he managed to get an agreement between Putin, and he managed to convince Prigozhin not to continue marching towards the Kremlin by telling him, hey, if you continue marching towards the Kremlin, Belarus will get involved, and will get involved in the support of Putin. And he, in Lukashenko's words, he says this is the reason that Prigozhin stopped marching. And the reason I ask that question is I'm always curious, and I ask this to a lot of leaders, is how much back-channel communications happen? Do you think there's back-channel communications right now directly between Iran and Israel? And how, if so, how often do you think they communicate? Or is it all through third parties and it's very limited? I'm just very curious as when there's countries that have tens of millions of people that are being impacted by their decisions, do the leaders at least talk to each other no matter how much they hate each other?
Usually the answer is no. Usually those leaders do not talk to each other because there's political ramifications if they do, right? In order for Netanyahu to have a conversation with any of the leaders in Iran, it would essentially make it look like Netanyahu is not in as powerful a position as he wants people to believe. Because if he's willing to take a call from any senior administrator, any senior theologian, it doesn't matter. Anybody he takes a call with is now, through the eyes of the people, equal to them. So because of that political posturing, what happens in conflict is they push communication down the chain. So it's some mid-level bureaucrat in, the Foreign Affairs Office who talks to another mid-level bureaucrat in a Foreign Affairs Office for a third country who talks to another mid-level bureaucrat in Iran. And only after these mid-level bureaucrats reach some sort of agreement does the call escalate up higher and higher. I mean, a fantastic example of this is what you've seen between Ukraine and Russia, where Putin intentionally chooses not to attend meetings he says he will attend because he wants to show that he has the power to not show up, which makes Russia look strong. And then when Zelensky shows up to a negotiating table and Putin doesn't show up, it makes Ukraine look weak, right? That's the game that leaders try to play.
Yeah, true.